for inviting me to speak this afternoon. This is actually a really great opportunity because normally I give talks and there are hundreds of people and there's really not a chance to have a good conversation. This is a nice small group, and so let's see if we can make this more interactive and a little bit more of a dialogue. So the subject today is abstraction in art and ink painting. And I hate the Chinese translation for abstraction. It's 抽象, is to take and to remove the image. That's a specific definition of abstraction, which is non-figurative or non-representational painting. But I want to use the term abstraction in a more broad sense, in a philosophical sense. And so the idea is, for me in abstraction, is this idea of simplification or reduction, allowing you to then move up conceptually into a broader category or a broader concept. And this works on a number of different levels. It allows you to speak more freely and flexibly, more openly about a number of topics. And then it also, if you use abstraction, there's a way in which you can reach a broader audience. So getting away from 抽象 as in removing the image or non-figurative, not using that definition so much and using a more conceptual definition. So I want to start with an example, a story. Here we see in his studio a young Yang Jiechang, who's a Foshan artist who many of us are familiar with in Hong Kong. In 1988, Yang Jiechang was invited to participate in the exhibition Les Magiciens de la Terre at the Pompidou Center in Paris. If you know the show, it's considered widely to be the first global contemporary art show. So the first contemporary art show that really tried to curate a global representation of art making around the world. So in the studio, these are the kinds of things that the curator Jean-Hubert Martin has selected to represent China and contemporary ink painting or contemporary art making in China for this show. So Jiechang is on his way to Paris, passing through Shenzhen, and Shenzhen customs basically confiscates all of his art. So he arrives in Paris with absolutely nothing. Let's see how I do this. So what the Pompidou Center does is they give him a studio, a huge open studio, larger than he'd ever had access to. He was a professor at the Guangzhou Art Academy. And they gave him unlimited supply of paper and an unlimited supply of ink. And so what he did was he created 15, sometimes the story is 20, but about 15 to 20 massive works. Okay, and he had to decide how he was going to paint for this new audience. When he saw the floor plan and he realized what artist going to paint. Because his earlier paintings, although they look like abstract paintings to us, for him were actually studies of old master painting, classical Chinese painting. And he realized that to reach this new audience, he needed to find a new language. And so what he did was he took each one, these massive compositions, and every day he added another layer of ink. He had 30 days until the show. And so each one of these paintings has anywhere, if you could put 2 layers of ink down, maybe 60, 30, 60, maybe upwards of 100 layers of ink each. He did roughly 15 to 20 works. So he calls this series 千层墨, which translates as 1,000 layers of ink. In English, he calls it 100 layers of ink because each work has 100 or fewer layers of ink. And that's all he did, a layer of ink every day. Okay. And then what you can see then, okay, this is the kind of texture that evolves after multiple layers of ink. So for the first time, he had the ability to use ink in this way. And what he discovered is one layer of ink after another layer of ink after another layer of ink produced a completely different kind of black. So the black changed from this kind of flat black or matte black to this kind of reflective and highly lustrous black. The texture also changed because after repeated drawing, okay, the paper ends up crinkling. And then after repeated layers of ink and repeated layers of drawing, it crinkles more and more and more. So he gets this highly textured, highly reflective surface. For him, this was fascinating. This idea of this simple action, one layer of ink, repeated over and over and over, produces a kind of accumulation and then a transformation. This is how he installed the work. 4 panels in a large room, floating off of the wall. Okay, so for him, this was a way of creating a space in which the viewer could have a relationship with the work that was not so much the work as a painting, but the 4 works together as a kind of space or experience, blurring the boundary between the artwork and the viewer. So this idea of being in relation to an object begins to blur. Here we see a show we did in Beijing using a series of works that he did after the Pompidou exhibition. Okay, this is a traveling in Mexico. These works were eventually shown in Mexico City. So he continued with this series even after the show. Now, what was interesting, and actually he continued the series all the way through the 90s. So the show in Pompidou was in '89, the show continued the series through the 90s, and then finally developed a new series after that, about 87, 88, no, 97. Yeah, 97. So what happened was curators who saw the work immediately saw this. Okay, this is Kazimir Malevich. This is Black Square. I believe the work was from 1915. Tatiana Tolstaya describes this: after completing this simple task, Malevich became the author of the most famous, most enigmatic, and most frightening painting known to man. So this is how this painting was received at the time in 1915. And it's basically a black square. And so many people approached Yang Liechang and said, do you know Kazimir Malevich? And he said, who is this? So he thought Kazimir Malevich was a taxi driver in a Russian movie he'd seen recently. Okay. So he didn't know the reference. Everyone else thought he was copying or following Kazimir Malevich. Then people said, you don't know Kazimir Malevich. You must know Ad Reinhardt. You must know Ad Reinhardt's black paintings. So Ad Reinhardt did a series of black paintings in the 1960s, oftentimes squares. Okay, talked very, very eloquently about the meaning of black. And of course, Yang Liechang didn't know who these people were talking about. And they said, you don't know Ad Reinhardt, you must know Mark Rothko. Okay, so Mark Rothko's very famous color field paintings. Many people don't know, but his last series of color field paintings were in all black and are installed right now in a place called the Rothko Chapel as part of the Menil Collection in Houston, Texas. It was a very, very famous installation. People looked at Liechang's installation and thought he was copying Mark Rothko. He found this very, very confusing because to him, his 1,000-layer, 100-layer of ink paintings were calligraphy. Okay, so we look at the painting and we say, well, there's no characters, there's no writing, there's no language, and there isn't even expressive brushwork. You can't see the brushwork, right? It's just layer and layer and layer of ink. So how can you have calligraphy without language, first of all, because calligraphy is text? And how can you have calligraphy if you don't have at least an expressive line, right? That's what distinguishes calligraphy from just ordinary text, is there's that beautiful calligraphic line expressing something. So Liechang basically said, I had to find a way to convey the meaning of calligraphy without language because my audience wouldn't be able to understand Chinese. And in terms of the expressive line, okay, maybe my audience would be able to understand the expressive line, but I do know that people have been working with the expressive line in abstraction for many, many years. So that's no longer interesting. So instead he comes up with this very simple brute action of putting a layer of ink down and repeating this daily, daily, daily. Now what is calligraphy? Calligraphy actually is a practice. The goal of calligraphy is actually not to produce a beautiful piece of writing. The goal of calligraphy is to practice, is to somehow transform yourself in the process of writing, and writing in a certain way, according to certain models. So studying the history of how writing and calligraphy has unfolded. So it's a way of acculturating yourself with language, with an embodied action in relation to a cultural history. And you can't do this. You can't write one piece of calligraphy and say I'm cultivated. You only become cultivated after a lifetime, after years and years and years of daily practice, repeated practice. And this accumulation of practice is what ultimately transforms you as a human being. That is what calligraphy is. We in China don't prize calligraphy because it's beautiful. We prize calligraphy because it's a central aspect of how one controls one's own cultivation as a human being. And that's what he wanted to convey. And so he conveyed this with the simple brute action that everybody could do and everybody could understand, which is to paint a square. So for him, this is the claim he makes about the series. And so that sounds great, okay, but is there evidence to support this claim? So this work right here was done in 1986, 3 years before the Pompidou exhibition. It's called 100 Layers of Calligraphy. This is him, a poor professor in Guangzhou Art Academy, Guangdong Art Academy. And he's earning about 2.5 renminbi per day. And he said one sheet of Xuan paper was about 6 to 7 renminbi. So it took him 2 days' salary just to buy one sheet of paper. And so he's a calligrapher, and so he's practicing calligraphy, but he realizes he can't practice on Xuan paper every day. So he took this one sheet of Xuan paper, and he kept writing over and over and over on the same sheet for months. And what happened was he realized that after even just a few weeks or a few days, you couldn't see the characters anymore. And that the layers of ink ended up transforming. You can probably see on this slide there are aspects or parts of the painting that are becoming reflective. Parts of it are flat and parts of it are reflective. This is because of the accumulation of ink. So already in 1986, he's stumbled upon these basic ideas in not creating a work of art, but literally through his daily practice, he discovers this. Here's another work in which he's painting a square. So the square is already an element of his vocabulary. For him, the square is something a little bit like Lao Tzu's uncarved block. So in the work on the left, what you see is a square that seems to be emerging out of this movement, this gestural, this kind of movement that you see with the brush and the ink. So movement yields form, is the idea, okay? And then on the work on the right, what you see is the form, you see the block itself. And then emerging out of that block, you see movement. So out of form emerges movement. From movement emerges form. The two together form a beautiful cycle. This is just an articulation of a simple truth in science, but also a truth that we understand through Taoist philosophy. So at this time, Yang Jieqiang was studying in a Taoist temple. He spent 2 years there. And then this, another work, this from 1984, in which Yang Jieqiang takes a sheet of paper, hangs it on a wall, takes a soccer ball, and then pours a pool of ink on the ground, and then it introduces a soccer net in front of the sheet of paper, and then kicks the soccer ball repeatedly through the pool of ink onto the net, making an impression on the paper. And he does this over and over and over and over again. So the image emerges through a series of repeated actions. This is 1984. So you can see there's ample evidence, actually, for Yang Jieqiang's claim. And the fact that he knew none of the other artists who had done black ink or black paintings, abstract paintings, okay, and yet this is the way in which, in the West, everybody wants to see his work. So my claim is that this idea that Chinese artists are essentially working in a vocabulary that was developed in the West, okay, in that mode, is oftentimes mistaken. What oftentimes, and particularly Chinese ink artists are doing, is they're working in using a set of concepts that are native to Chinese philosophy, Chinese culture, and Chinese history, but they're performing radical simplifications, deconstructions, and reductions, okay, on this language. And producing work which, lo and behold, actually resembles some things that have been done in the West. And we make a huge category error when we look at this art and we use Western concepts and Western terms to analyze what's going on. This is not abstract painting. This is, in fact, calligraphy. And once we embrace that, then the true meaning of what he's doing comes out. So this is going to be the theme of my talk. So if this is the theme, one of the things we need to do is we need to find a way to describe this system of art making in China so that we know what the artists are doing when I claim they perform a radical simplification. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Now, when we talk about ink, a lot of people talk about it in terms of it being a medium, okay? And so it is. It's carbon soot suspended in water with an animal glue, typically applied with a round pliant brush, often also used for calligraphy, onto strand paper, paper or silk, an absorbent ground. And that's basically what it is. Now, it has amazing material properties, which are distinctive and unique. Okay, so we could talk about that later. But it is a medium, not a problem. It's